If you are black and you have type O blood, then inside your body is a record older than your name, older than your country, older than any history book ever written. For most of the 20th century, blood type was treated as a small medical detail, a letter on a hospital form, a code for transfusions, nothing more. But the moment scientists began reading the DNA hidden behind that single letter, the whole story turned. And the deepest part of it isn't about one people, or one land, or some single migration. It points straight to where everything began, to where humanity took its very first steps. So where does that blood really come from? Why could the small letter O on your medical chart be one of the oldest things a human being still carries? And why does almost no one tell you that your blood may not be a late branch on the human family tree, but the very root that every other branch grows from? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, DNA will tell you something that the histories of ancestry usually leave out, and you will never look at your blood type the same way again. To understand why this blood matters so much, we have to start with how a whole century of science underestimated it. The story of blood type begins in 1901, when an Austrian scientist named Karl Landsteiner noticed that some blood samples clumped together when mixed, while others stayed smooth. He had just discovered the blood group system, and he found 4 basic types: A, B, AB, and O. But for decades afterward, blood type was seen only as a medical label, useful for transfusions, and saying nothing about where you came from. And there's a popular belief you still hear repeated everywhere, that type O is the oldest blood type, the original, the ancestral form. This is where we need to be precise, because the truth matters more than a story that just sounds good. When geneticists finally opened up the DNA inside the very gene that determines blood type, things weren't as simple as the folklore. Modern research leans the other way. Type A is more likely the ancestral form, while type O arose from a mutation that broke the A gene. In other words, O is not the oldest in the way people tend to assume. But, and here's what matters, the real story of the letter O is far better than that myth. Because when scientists traced where the mutation that creates type O first appeared, the trail didn't lead to Europe, and it didn't lead to Asia. It led straight to the continent where our species was born. The old belief that your blood type can't tell you anything about your origins is about to collapse completely, because it turns out it tells you a great deal. It tells a story longer than any kingdom, and that story begins in a place that most books about ancestry still treat as a footnote, rather than as the opening of everything. Your blood type is determined by a single gene sitting on chromosome 9. That gene instructs an enzyme that decides whether sugar molecules called antigens get placed on the surface of your red blood cells. If the gene works fully, you have the A or B antigen. But in type O, that gene carries a small defect. A piece of DNA is lost, just a single letter of the genetic code goes missing, and that tiny loss is enough to shut the enzyme down. The result is red blood cells that carry no antigen on their surface at all. A type O red cell, in that sense, is a bare cell, flying no A or B flag. And here is the astonishing thing genetics discovered. The specific mutation that creates the most common version of type O, that tiny deletion in the gene, did not appear randomly and independently all over the world. It carries a pattern, a distinct genetic signature in the DNA around it, that lets researchers trace it back through time like following a family line. And the way they do that is as clever as the story itself. Every time a mutation is passed down through the generations, other small mutations gradually accumulate beside it, like rings on a tree trunk. By counting and comparing those markers in type O carriers across the continents, scientists can estimate how old the variant is and where it first appeared. And when they did, the trail led back to Africa. That mutation arose on the African continent very early, and here is the most important part. It was already there before the first groups of humans left Africa to spread across the planet. Let that sink in for a moment. Our own species spent most of its history inside Africa, and only left in one great wave around 60 to 70,000 years ago. The letter O on your medical chart was already there before that departure. It is not something that popped up in some corner of the world and spread back. It was part of the very genetic baggage that the first people carried when they walked out of the cradle. They took it across deserts, across straits, across sheets of ice, to every continent. That's why today you find type O everywhere, from the indigenous tribes of the Americas to the islands of the Pacific. But the source of that trace, the point where it first appeared, lies in Africa. And for people of African descent who carry type O today, that carries a special meaning. You are not holding a distant copy of something that began somewhere else and was only passed on to you. You are standing closer to the source than almost anyone on the planet. That mutation was born on the very land your ancestors belonged to, and if they left it at all, they left later and carried it in their veins. But blood type is only the first thread. To truly see how deep your blood runs, we have to step back and look at the entire human family tree and ask a question very few people are ever asked. When scientists map the global distribution of blood types, the patterns show up clearly. Type A is common in Western Europe, Type B reaches high concentrations in northern India, and Type O is spread widely across Africa and dominant in many populations of the world. But if you stop at counting which type is most common where, you'll miss something far deeper, because the real question isn't which blood type is the most numerous, but which bloodline is the oldest, which is the root, and which is only a branch. And here, modern genetics says something that most people were never taught in any classroom. All of humanity outside Africa, every European, every Asian, every indigenous American, every Polynesian, are all descended from a relatively small group that left Africa tens of thousands of years ago. And when a small group breaks away from a larger population, they carry only a fraction of the genetic diversity that was there. Scientists call this the founder effect. Each time humans moved farther from Africa, migrating stage after stage, each new group was a smaller subset of the one before it. That's why there's an astonishing rule in genetics. The farther you go from Africa, the more human genetic diversity drops. In other words, every people outside Africa is a branch, a piece broken off from a much larger tree. And that tree, the main trunk with the deepest roots, still stands in Africa. This is why when geneticists measure the diversity of populations across the planet, they always find the same result. The greatest genetic diversity of humankind, the widest genetic distance between one person and another, is not in Europe or Asia, but inside Africa. Two communities living in two different regions of Africa can differ genetically more than a European differs from an East Asian. Think about that. The entire difference between a Swede and a Japanese person, in terms of genetic depth, can be smaller than the difference between two groups living on the African continent. That is not a small detail. It is the mark of a very large truth, that Africa has been humanity's home longer than everywhere else combined, long enough to accumulate a depth that nowhere else has. Put it into a timeline. The oldest fossils we know of that are considered modern humans, found in North Africa, are around 300,000 years old. For almost all of that vast span, our species lived, evolved, and branched out entirely inside Africa. The migration outward, the one that gave rise to every other people in the world, happened only in a small piece at the end of that story. There are lineages in Africa, like the ancestors of the southern hunter-gatherers, that split off from the rest of humanity hundreds of thousands of years ago and have kept that depth to this day. In other words, most of the human story is an African story, and everything that happened outside it is only the final chapter, written quickly on the last few pages. So when you are of African descent, your blood doesn't sit on a far branch of the human family tree. It sits near the trunk, near the root, and there's no evidence for that more powerful and more staggering than what we're about to talk about. A lineage so ancient that when they found it, scientists had to rewrite the age of the entire human family tree. Inside every man there's a special part of the genome, the Y chromosome, passed down almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, an unbroken thread stretching into the past. By comparing the Y chromosomes of men around the world, scientists can reconstruct the family tree of humanity's paternal line and find its root, the man sometimes poetically called Y chromosomal Adam, the most recent common paternal ancestor of every living man. For years, that root was estimated at around 140,000 years ago. That number seemed settled, agreed upon. Then, in 2013, everything changed. The story began in a surprisingly humble way. An African-American man named Albert Perry sent in a DNA sample for a genealogy test, like millions of people do. But when scientists, led by Fernando Mendez and Michael Hammer, analyzed the Y chromosome in that sample, they found something unprecedented. His lineage didn't match any known branch on the tree. It split off earlier than all of them, at a point so deep that it pushed the age of the common paternal ancestor back to around 338,000 years ago. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 338,000 years. That is older than the oldest fossils then considered modern human. This lineage is so ancient that it almost challenges our very definition of when our species began. It was named A00, and it is the oldest known branch of the entire male family tree of humankind. The deepest root, the branch nearest the base. This discovery was published in 2013 in a leading journal of human genetics, and it caused a shock for exactly that reason. A lineage no one expected, older than the point science believed was the start of modern humans, suddenly emerging from a blood sample sent through the mail. The name Y chromosomal atom that people like to use can make us imagine a single first man. In fact, it just means a point of convergence, the root node that every living paternal line traces back to. And what A00 did was drag that root node much deeper into the past, so deep it forced scientists to widen the very time frame of the human story. That root node is in Africa. It was always in Africa. When researchers traced where A00 still lives in the world today, the trail led to a very specific place, the Umbo people of Western Cameroon, in Central Africa. Feel the weight of this. The deepest root, the oldest branch of the male family tree of all humanity, does not sit in a museum in Europe, and does not sit in Asia, but is still beating in the veins of people living in Cameroon today. And it was found not in an ancient tomb or a fossilized skeleton, but in the blood of a living man of African descent, a man who probably never knew he carried within him a lineage older than almost anything science had ever assigned to humanity. That is the kind of heritage that ancestors of African descent carry, not a late branch grown at the edge, but the roots, the deepest and the oldest, driven straight into the ground where everything began. And there's another trace inside the blood of people of African descent, one that most of the rest of the world almost completely lacks. It sits in a different blood group system, far less famous than ABO, called the Duffy system. In most Europeans and Asians, red blood cells carry Duffy antigens called FIA and FYB. They're small molecules on the cell surface, so common that in many populations almost everyone has them. But in people of West and Central African descent, there's an astonishing fact. More than 95% carry a variant that leaves their red blood cells with no Duffy antigens at all. It's called Duffy negative. This is one of the most sharply distinguishing genetic traits on the planet, nearly universal in people of African descent and extremely rare almost everywhere else. Someone could look at the Duffy trait in your blood and say, with high confidence, that your lineage is rooted in Africa. And here's the key. It is not a meaningless coincidence, it is a shield. There's a malaria parasite called Plasmodium vivax, and to invade a red blood cell, it needs to grab onto those very Duffy antigens like grabbing a doorknob. If your red cells don't have that doorknob, the parasite has almost no way in. In other words, your African ancestors evolved a lock that one of the greatest killers in human history could not open. This is so pronounced that across most of West and Central Africa, the malaria caused by Plasmodium vivax has nearly vanished, simply because the population there slammed shut the door it needs. That's the mark of thousands of years of survival across lands where malaria was a death sentence. And that story of survival doesn't stop at Duffy. Type O itself is woven into the war against disease. Some studies note that people with type O have a significantly lower risk of severe malaria than other groups, though the link varies by region and is still being worked out. But Duffy and type O are only two names in a whole arsenal that African ancestors forged against malaria. There's also the sickle cell trait, which changes the shape of red cells just enough that the parasite struggles to survive, the G6PD deficiency variant, and hemoglobin C, concentrated in West Africa. Scientists call these balanced polymorphisms. Inheriting one copy of the sickle cell gene helps you survive malaria, but inheriting two causes a painful disease, and that very cost is what keeps the gene from spreading to the whole population. In other words, Africa is the continent besieged by malaria the most fiercely and the longest, and the body of people of African descent answered with a whole set of genetic shields layered on top of one another, each aimed at a different weak spot of the enemy. Through enough generations, those who carried these marks survived slightly better, and that slightly better edge gradually came to dominate. Your blood carries not only the trace of where your ancestors lived, it carries the trace of what they survived. That is not a lifeless medical detail on a piece of paper. It is a medal of endurance, carved straight into the blood and handed down to you across hundreds of generations. So how did those ancient marks travel from the African cradle to the blood of people of African descent all over the world today? The answer is one of the longest and most painful migration stories humanity has ever known. For tens of thousands of years, these bloodlines stayed and spread across the African continent, a land so vast and diverse it holds more genetic depth than all the rest of the world combined. Ancient lineages took root, branched, layered over one another through countless generations. Then history turned a brutal corner. Over centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, more than 12 million Africans were forced from their homelands, chained and pushed into the holds of ships crossing the ocean, to the Americas and other distant lands. And they didn't come from some vague place called simply Africa. They came from very specific coastal regions that historians today have mapped. Nearly half of those taken, around 46%, embarked from West Central Africa, the stretch of land running from Gabon down to present-day Congo and Angola. A further large share came from the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra along the West African coast, and from Senegambia in the far west. For those taken to mainland North America in particular, most traced back to Senegambia and Angola. In other words, the very regions that carry humanity's most ancient genetic depth were also the ones torn apart by the machinery of the slave trade. And that means the blood carried away was not some accidental, young bloodline. It was the blood of the root continent itself. They were stripped of their names and given new ones, stripped of their language, stripped of their homeland, their people, their family history. The records that should have held their ancestry were either torn up or never written. For countless families of African descent, the thread back to their roots was cut deliberately and completely, so that later generations grew up not knowing where they came from on that vast continent. But there was one thing no one could take away, one thing not written on any piece of paper and untouched by any bill of sale. That was the blood. The type O mutation born in Africa was still there in their red cells. The Duffy negative variant that blocks malaria was still passed down, from mother to child, generation after generation, no matter how far they were carried. The ancient lineages on the Y chromosome and in the DNA, passed down the maternal line, still continued their unbroken thread, even when every paper record had vanished. That is why genetics today holds such a moving power for people of African descent who were severed from their roots. When the papers fall silent, the blood still speaks. A person may not know the name of their great-great-great-grandfather, not the village, not the people their ancestor was taken from, but the blood in their veins still remembers the road their family was forced to forget. And now, for the first time in history, science has the tools to read that road again. That letter O, that Duffy trait, those ancient lineages, are all pieces of a map leading back to a place that generations thought was lost forever. Now put it all together, because when you do, something overturns the way we're usually taught to think. Throughout this whole video, and throughout most of the way the world tells the story of ancestry, people tend to assume that African blood is a humble beginning, a primitive starting point from which greater, more advanced civilizations rose elsewhere. But DNA says something almost exactly the opposite. The mutation that makes your type O blood arose in Africa before humans left. The oldest male lineage ever found, A00, still lives in a community in Cameroon, and that paternal story has a twin on the maternal side. Just as the Y chromosome passes from father to son, there's a part of the DNA called mitochondrial DNA that passes from mother to child, forming an unbroken thread of the maternal line. And when scientists build the family tree of humanity's maternal line, they find the same astonishing thing. The deepest and oldest branches, the ones labeled L, all have their root in Africa. The branch at the very bottom of the whole tree, the oldest maternal branch, which scientists call L0, is rooted in populations like the Khoisan of southern Africa, hunter-gatherer communities whose lineage split off from the rest of humanity so early that they carry some of the oldest genetic traces still alive on the planet. Every maternal line of every person outside Africa, without a single exception, nests inside the African family tree like a small branch grown from a larger bough. You can take the mitochondrial DNA of anyone in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, and always find it tucked inside a branch that already began in Africa. Put it all together, and the picture is undeniable. Blood type points to Africa. The paternal line points to Africa. The maternal line points to Africa, and the greatest genetic diversity of all humankind still lies inside that continent. If you are of African descent and you carry type O blood, you do not stand on a distant, newly grown branch of the human family tree. You stand near the trunk, near the root from which every other branch, every other people on this planet, split off and grew. This is the biggest reversal of all. Throughout the whole story, we kept searching for where your blood came from, as if it were the descendant of something that came before it. But DNA tells us your blood is not a descendant that came later. In its deepest aspects, it is the very origin, the ancient stream that all the others are only late variations branching off from. Europeans, Asians, indigenous Americans, all carry within them a piece of the African story. But only people of African descent kept it nearly whole, as deep and as old as it truly is. Your blood doesn't borrow its depth from anyone. That depth is your own, and it is older than almost anything a human being can claim as theirs. And so we arrive at the question we should have asked from the very beginning, but only now can answer properly. Throughout this whole journey, we kept asking, who are your ancestors, and where does your blood come from, as if the answer lay somewhere far away that had to be searched for. But perhaps that was never the right question. The right question isn't which line did your blood split off from. The right question is, why did the world forget that this blood is the first blood? Because look back at the road we've just traveled. The letter O arose in Africa before the Great Migration. The oldest living paternal line is in Cameroon. The deepest maternal lines are rooted in Africa. The greatest genetic depth of humankind lies inside that continent. This is not a humble beginning to be surpassed and left behind. This is the root from which everything else grew. A person's identity should never have been built on whether their blood is late or early, secondary or main, and we're not saying this blood is worth more than that blood. But if anyone grew up with the idea that their blood was something that came after, came late, stood at the margins of the human story, then DNA has just said the opposite, quietly and undeniably. Think of the man in Cameroon carrying the oldest lineage of all humanity in his blood without knowing it. Think of the woman of African descent in a faraway city, generations and an ocean from her ancestral home, still carrying in her red cells the malaria shield her ancestors forged over thousands of years. Think of yourself, if you are black and you have type O blood, looking at that letter on your medical chart as if it meant nothing. It means something. It means you don't just carry a bloodline. You carry the first bloodline, the stream that every other line on this planet borrowed from in order to begin to exist. And there's something beautiful in how science flips the old story. For centuries, people told a version in which Africa was always the humble starting point, the base for others to rise from. But the most modern tools of all, the machines that can read every letter of the genome, are quietly saying the opposite. They don't say this blood is nobler than that blood. They only say one simple truth about time, that this blood came first, that it is the mainstream, and all the others are branches flowing out of it. For someone who grew up not knowing where their ancestors came from, taught that their origin was a blank, this is an almost unbelievable thing to hear, that the blank was never truly blank, it was only unread. And now, at last, it is being read again, one letter at a time, and what emerges is not an absence, but the most ancient depth a human being can carry. You do not stand at the end of the human family tree, you stand at its very root. So the next time you see the lone letter O on a hospital form, remember that you are looking at one of the oldest artifacts a human being still carries. You will know about the mutation that arose in Africa before humanity walked out into the world. You will know about A00, the oldest paternal line on Earth, still living in a community in Cameroon. You will know about the Duffy trait, the malaria shield your African ancestors forged and handed down. And you will know what DNA finally said out loud. Your blood is not a late branch of the human story. It is the root from which that story began. It was not erased from history, it was only forgotten in the way history was retold, while all along it stayed right there, in the blood, waiting to be called by its true name. Because a bloodline does not lose its age on the day people stop seeing it. It only waits for the day someone has the tools and the courage to read it again.